Please don't leave. The little black girl cried to the biker as an elevator door slammed behind them abruptly. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The elevator door slammed shut with a loud, echoing noise that sent a chill down her spine. The little black girl stood frozen for a moment, her small body trembling with fear. Her wide eyes, filled with panic, locked onto the biker standing just a few feet away. Please don't leave, she cried, her voice shaking, barely above a whisper. The biker, a tall man with a weathered face and a deep, calm presence, stared down at her, momentarily caught off guard by the desperation in her voice. His hand instinctively moved towards the leather vest on his chest, where the emblem of his club, the Iron Riders, gleamed under the fluorescent lights. He had seen a lot in his time, but nothing like this. The little girl's face was streaked with tears, her clothes torn and dirty, as if she had been running for miles. Her breath came in short gasps, and the panic in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. What's going on? The biker asked, his voice low and steady, the kind of voice that could soothe a storm. The girl wiped her face with the back of her hand, looking around as if expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. He's after me, she whispered, her words barely audible. He'll hurt me if he finds me. The biker frowned, his instincts kicking in. He glanced toward the elevator doors, the sound of footsteps growing louder from the hallway. Who's after you? He asked, his eyes narrowing. The girl hesitated, glancing over her shoulder one last time before she took a step closer to the biker. My stepfather, she said, her voice trembling. He's always been mean, but today he. Her voice trailed off, and for a moment, she couldn't finish the sentence. The biker felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had been part of the Iron Riders for years, and he had seen his fair share of trouble, but nothing like this. The girl's stepfather? He couldn't let that slide. No man, especially a man who was supposed to care for her, should ever hurt a child. I won't let him get to you, the biker said firmly, his voice low but resolute. He stepped closer to her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You're safe now. I won't let anyone hurt you. Just as he spoke, the sound of footsteps stopped right outside the elevator. The girl gasped, looking up at the biker with wide, terrified eyes. The biker took a deep breath, his mind racing with the options. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. No one had ever come to the rescue of a scared little girl quite like this before. But he wasn't about to back down. He was a member of the Iron Riders, and when they made a promise, they kept it. Without saying another word, he grabbed her hand and pulled her behind him. The elevator doors were still closed, and the distant sound of footsteps meant the threat was still looming. But the biker was ready. He had no idea what kind of trouble they were about to face, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let this little girl face it alone. As the elevator dinged open, he stepped out, scanning the hallway for any sign of danger. The girl clutched his hand tighter, her small fingers trembling in his grip. This was just the beginning. The biker took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the hallway. The girl's grip tightened on his hand as they stepped cautiously out of the elevator. He could feel the cold air pressing against him, and his senses were on high alert. The fear in her eyes was palpable, and it only fueled his determination to protect her. They moved quietly down the hallway, the sound of their footsteps barely noticeable in the stillness. As they approached the end of the hall, the distant sound of a door opening echoed in the silence, followed by the unmistakable sound of a man's voice. Where is she? The voice growled, rough and angry. She can't be far. I know she's here. The biker's muscles tensed. His instincts screamed that the man was close, but he didn't know how close. The little girl beside him was trembling, her small hand clinging to his like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. It's going to be okay, the biker murmured, looking down at her with a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I'm not going to let him hurt you. We're getting out of here. He led her toward a stairwell, hoping the man wouldn't notice them. But as they reached the corner, they were stopped in their tracks by the sound of a door slamming open behind them. Where do you think you're going? The voice was unmistakable, the girl's stepfather. He was here, and he was angry. The biker didn't hesitate. He stepped in front of the girl, his body blocking her from view. "You need to leave," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Now." The man took a step forward, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. "You think you can stop me?" he sneered, his hand moving toward the gun holstered on his belt. "This doesn't concern you. Stay out of it." But the biker was already moving. He stepped forward, using his body to block the man's path. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice low and cold. "And neither is she." The girl's stepfather looked him up and down, sizing him up. The biker was taller, broader, and looked like he could handle himself in a fight. But the man wasn't intimidated. He drew his gun slowly, the sound of metal scraping against leather making the air around them feel heavy. "I'm warning you," the man said, his voice trembling with rage. "Get out of my way." The biker's hand moved instinctively to his side, but he didn't draw his own weapon. Instead, he stood his ground, his gaze never leaving the man's face. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Put the gun down." The man's eyes flickered with hesitation, just for a moment, before his anger took over. "I said move," he snarled. But before he could take another step, a noise echoed through the hallway. A loud crash followed by a chorus of motorcycle engines roaring to life. The biker's heart skipped a beat. His brothers were here. The sound of 50 motorcycles revving up at once was enough to send a shiver down anyone's spine. The man froze, his eyes widening as the sound of the engines grew louder, closer. "What the hell is that?" he demanded, his gun still aimed at the biker. The biker didn't flinch. "Family," he said simply. "And you're about to meet them." In the blink of an eye, the hallway was filled with the sound of boots pounding the floor, and then they appeared. The Iron Riders, a gang of bikers who had been loyal to each other through thick and thin. They poured into the hallway like a storm, a wall of leather and muscle. Each one of them had their own unique look, their own history, but they shared one thing: loyalty. They were family. "Get away from her," one of the bikers growled, his voice as menacing as the rumble of his bike. The man with the gun hesitated, his eyes darting between the biker and the approaching gang. "I'm not afraid of you," he said, trying to sound tough, but his voice wavered. "You should be," the biker replied, his tone cold as ice. The man's hands shook, his grip on the gun faltering. He had no idea what he had just walked into. With a sudden, fluid motion, one of the bikers lunged forward, knocking the gun from the man's hand with a swift strike to his wrist. The man stumbled back, fear now evident on his face. "You're done," the biker said, his voice firm. "Get out of here before things get worse for you." The girl's stepfather didn't say another word. His eyes darted to the bikers surrounding him, then to the girl, and with one last desperate glance, he turned and bolted down the hallway, disappearing into the shadows. The bikers stood there for a moment, watching him go. Then, the leader of the group, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a deep voice, turned to the little girl and gave her a smile. "You're safe now," he said gently. The girl, still trembling, looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and exhaustion. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The biker knelt down to her level, his expression softening. "You don't have to thank us," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "We protect our own. You're part of the family now." The girl's face lit up with a small, hopeful smile. It was the first time. In a long time she had felt safe, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe that everything was going to be okay. The girl looked up at the biker, her small face now showing a hint of relief. Her body, once trembling with fear, was slowly starting to relax. The bikers, one by one, moved away from the hallway, giving the girl and the biker some space. The leader, who had helped calm her down, looked at the others, signaling them to spread out. He kneeled down to her level, his eyes softening as he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now. We've got you," he said in a voice that was steady and full of conviction. She nodded, her lips trembling as she tried to find her words. I don't know what to do," she whispered, her eyes still filled with fear. The biker could feel her pain, the weight of everything she had been through pressing down on her small shoulders. He wanted to promise her that everything would be all right, but he knew the road ahead would be difficult. "You don't have to do anything right now," he said softly. "Just let us take care of you. We'll figure this out together." His voice carried the calm assurance of someone who had seen the worst of the world and still chose to protect those in need. But my mom, she's gone. She's not coming back. Her voice broke, and she started to sob quietly. The biker's heart ached at the sound of her distress. He could see the loss in her eyes, the feeling of abandonment that had taken root deep inside her. "I know, sweetheart," he said, his voice filled with empathy. "But you don't have to face this alone. You have us now." His words hung in the air, thick with the promise of protection. The girl's sobs began to quiet down, and she looked up at him, her eyes searching for some kind of reassurance. "I don't know what's going to happen," she said, her voice still shaky. "But I'm scared." The biker nodded, understanding the fear that gripped her heart. "We're scared too," he admitted. "But you're not alone. We'll keep you safe, no matter what it takes." He stood up, looking at the rest of the bikers. They were standing by, watching the girl, their faces hardened with the same determination that had always driven them. "We'll need to get her out of here," the leader said. "We can't stay here much longer. We've made enough noise already." Another biker stepped forward, a tall man with a rugged look and a deep voice. "We've got a place for her," he said. "It's not far from here. We'll keep her hidden until we can figure out what to do next." The leader nodded, turning back to the girl. "How do you feel about that?" he asked. She hesitated for a moment, glancing around at the bikers, their protective presence offering a strange sense of comfort. "I think I'll be okay," she said quietly, her voice still shaky but stronger than before. "I just don't want to go back there. Not to him." Her words hit the leader like a punch to the gut. He knew exactly who him was. The girl's stepfather, the man who had terrorized her for so long. The man who had no business calling himself a father. The man who had taken her childhood and replaced it with fear and abuse. "You won't go back there," the leader promised, his voice full of resolve. "Not while we're breathing. We're getting you out of here. You're staying with us." He looked over at his crew. "Let's move. We don't have time to waste." The bikers quickly formed up, their movements smooth and coordinated. Each one knew their role, each one ready to act without hesitation. The leader stepped forward, motioning for the girl to follow him. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes still lingering on the door, the place that had been the source of so much pain. But then, with a small nod, she stepped forward, her hand once again grasping his. They made their way down the hallway, the girl walking just behind him. The air felt heavy, but there was something else now, hope. It was a feeling she hadn't known in a long time, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be all right. The bikers moved swiftly, exiting the building and heading toward their bikes. The engines roared to life, and the convoy of motorcycles rumbled down the street. The girl clung to the biker, her small body pressed against his as the wind whipped past them. They rode for what felt like hours, the city lights fading behind them as they traveled into the quieter, safer parts of town. The girl's eyes fluttered closed as the rhythmic sound of the bikes, the gentle hum of the road beneath them, lulled her into a sense of security. She had no idea where they were going, but it didn't matter. For the first time in a long time, she felt safe. As the convoy rolled through the quiet streets, the leader of the bikers glanced over his shoulder at the girl. She was nestled against him, her face relaxed, the tension that had gripped her earlier slowly fading away. He knew the journey ahead would be long and filled with challenges. But for now, in this moment, she was safe. And that was all that mattered. The convoy of motorcycles rolled into the quiet neighborhood just as the first rays of morning light started to break through the sky. The girl sat close to the biker, her head resting against his back as they made their way down a narrow street lined with modest houses. The sound of the engines echoed through the empty streets, but the noise wasn't enough to disturb the peacefulness of the area. The biker glanced over his shoulder at the girl, noticing how relaxed she seemed, her grip on him still firm but not as frantic as before. She had fallen asleep, her small body swaying slightly with the rhythm of the ride. He couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The fear that had gripped her just hours ago seemed to have faded, replaced by a quiet trust. He couldn't promise her that everything would be easy, but he could promise her one thing. She would never face it alone. The group of bikers, all of them seasoned veterans in their own right, followed closely behind, keeping a sharp lookout. They had made sure they weren't followed, and as they pulled into a secluded area, the leader of the group signaled for them to stop. The sound of the engines died down, and a heavy silence settled over the group. The leader, a man known only as Hawk, turned to the girl as she slowly woke up. "We're here," he said gently, his voice calm and reassuring. The girl blinked her eyes and rubbed them with the back of her hand. She looked around, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. The house they had pulled up to was small but well kept, the lawn neatly trimmed, and the porch inviting. It looked nothing like the place she had just left behind. The bikers dismounted their bikes, each of them walking with purpose as they began securing the area. Hawk stayed by the girl's side, offering her a comforting smile. "This is a safe place. You can relax here," he said. She hesitated, looking from him to the house, unsure if she could really believe it. "But what if he comes looking for me?" she asked, her voice trembling again. Hawk's expression softened, and he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "He won't find you here," he said with a firm conviction. "We'll make sure of it." The girl nodded slowly, her eyes still wide with a mix of fear and exhaustion. She had been running for so long, and now, for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a sense of safety. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't over, but it was a start. "Come on, let's get you inside," Hawk said, gently guiding her toward the door. The other bikers followed, ensuring everything was secure before heading inside. The house was cozy, with soft lighting and comfortable furniture. It felt like a home, a stark contrast to the harsh environment she had just escaped. Hawk led the girl to a small room at the back of the house, where a bed with fresh linens awaited her. "You can rest here for now," he said, motioning to the bed. "Take your time, and we'll figure out what to do next." The girl hesitated before sitting down on the edge of the bed. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and fear. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. Hawk smiled softly. "You don't have to say anything. You're safe now. That's all that matters." He stood up and walked toward the door, but before he left, he turned back to her. "We're all here for you. We won't leave you alone." The girl nodded, her eyes still uncertain but a little less fearful. She watched as Hawk closed the door behind him, leaving her alone in the room for the first time in what felt like forever. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Outside, the bikers gathered around the living room, their voices low as they discussed what to do next. Hawk sat with them, his mind racing with plans, but he couldn't help but think about the girl. She had been through so much, and it wasn't over yet. They had to protect her, not just from the man she had run from, but from everything that had led her to this point. "We keep her safe, no matter what it takes," Hawk said, his voice firm. The others nodded in agreement. "We'll do whatever it takes," one of the bikers, a man named Diesel, said. "She's one of us now." The room was filled with a sense of purpose, a bond that went beyond the leather jackets they wore. They were a family, and when one of them was in need, they all stepped up. "We'll start by getting in touch with some people who can help," Hawk continued. "We'll get her the support she needs. But for now, she rests. That's all we can do." The group settled into a quiet understanding, each of them knowing the road ahead would be long and difficult. But they were ready to protect, ready to fight, and ready to ensure that this little girl would never be alone again. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the house, Hawk stood up and walked to the window. He looked out over the quiet neighborhood, his thoughts drifting to the girl and the promise he had made. "You're safe now," he whispered to himself, "and we'll make sure it stays that way." The night was just beginning, and they had a long road ahead of them. But as long as they were together, they knew they could face anything. The morning light streamed through the blinds, casting a soft glow on the room. The girl, now tucked into the bed with fresh linens, slept soundly. Her breath was slow and steady, a peaceful contrast to the chaos that had surrounded her only hours before. Hawk stood by the window, watching the neighborhood outside. The calm of the area was a stark reminder of how much she had been through and how far she had come. But he knew the calm wouldn't last forever. There were still threats out there, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down. He turned away from the window and looked toward the other bikers, who were gathered in the living room. Diesel, the big guy with a gruff demeanor, was pouring coffee, while Colossus, the quiet one, was flipping through a stack of papers. "What's the plan?" Diesel asked, his voice heavy with the weight of the situation. Hawk sat down at the table, his brow furrowed as he thought. "We lay low for now," he said, his voice calm but serious. We'll stay here until we're sure the stepfather isn't coming after her. But we need to get her the help she deserves. We can't just keep her hidden forever. Colossus looked up from the papers. You think he'll come after her again? He won't stop until he gets her back, Hawk replied, his eyes hardening. He's a cop. He knows how to use the system. And he'll do whatever it takes to get his hands on her again. We need to be ready for that. Diesel grunted in agreement. So what's next? I'll reach out to some contacts. We'll find a lawyer who can help. We need to get her into a safe program, one that'll protect her from him for good, Hawk said. But for now, we keep her safe. We stay here. We don't make any noise. The room fell silent as everyone nodded in agreement. They all understood the weight of the situation. They weren't just protecting a girl, they were protecting their own. After a few minutes, Diesel broke the silence. What about him? The stepfather, I mean. What do we do if he shows up here? Hawk's jaw tightened. We don't let him in. We don't escalate things unless we have to. We protect her legally, but if it comes down to it, we'll do what we need to do to keep her safe. The bikers nodded again, their faces hard with determination. They were a family, and they would do whatever it took to keep one of their own safe. Hawk stood up, his mind racing with plans and contingencies. We'll take turns watching the house. No one goes anywhere alone. If he shows up, we'll deal with it. As the bikers made their plans, the girl stirred in the bedroom. Hawk walked quietly toward her, not wanting to wake her just yet. She looked so small, so fragile, lying there. Her hair was messy, and her face was still streaked with the remnants of the tears she had cried earlier. He had promised her that she would be safe here, and he intended to keep that promise. He sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at her for a moment. She had been through more than any child should have to endure, and he could see it in the way she slept. There was a weariness to her that no child should ever have to feel. But despite it all, she had survived. She was strong, and he would make sure that strength wouldn't be taken away from her. He gently brushed a lock of hair from her face, careful not to wake her. Then he stood up and left the room, closing the door softly behind him. The bikers were already making preparations, getting ready for the long road ahead. They had a lot of work to do, and time was running out. Hawk gathered them together, his face set with resolve. We keep the girl safe. We don't let her out of our sight. And we stay ready. If her stepfather comes after her, we'll be ready for him. There was no hesitation in the room. These men had seen too much, lived through too much, to back down now. They knew what it meant to protect their own, and they were ready to do whatever it took. As they discussed their next steps, Hawk's mind kept returning to the girl. He couldn't help but wonder how she was feeling, what she was thinking. It was impossible to forget the terror in her eyes when she had first arrived, her world shattered. But he knew she was strong. She would survive this, just like she had survived everything else. And they would be there for her, every step of the way. As the day wore on, the house grew quieter, the bikers settling into their roles. But Hawk couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The calm wouldn't last forever. And when the storm came, they had to be ready. He took a deep breath and glanced at the front door. No matter what happened, they wouldn't let her face it alone. They were family, and they would protect her until the very end. The sound of the motorcycles was still echoing in Hawk's mind as he walked through the house, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. It was late afternoon now, and the weight of the day was starting to settle in. The girl was safe for now, but Hawk knew that the calm wouldn't last. They had to stay vigilant. The threat was still out there, and he wasn't about to let it catch them off guard. He paused in the living room, his gaze falling on the other bikers. Diesel was sitting by the window, keeping watch, while Colossus and Shadow were going through the papers, making sure everything was in order. We need to know everything about this guy, Hawk said, his voice low and steady. We can't let him slip through our fingers. We have to know where he is, what he's planning, and how we can protect her from him. Diesel nodded, his eyes narrowing. I've already made a few calls, he said, his voice heavy with intent. We'll find him. Good, Hawk replied, turning to face the others. We need to be prepared for anything. And I mean anything. He paced for a moment, his mind racing. We can't let him hurt her again. No one else will. His eyes flicked to the girl's room, where she was still resting. He felt a pang in his chest at the thought of what she had gone through. She was only a child, and she had already seen too much pain. Hawk had promised to protect her, but he couldn't help but wonder if he was doing enough. The others continued making their plans, but Hawk couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Every minute that passed brought them closer to the moment when her stepfather would show up. The man didn't know the meaning of giving up, and Hawk knew that once he found out where she was, he would come for her without hesitation. "We have to move her," Hawk said, his voice rising with urgency. "We can't wait for him to come here. We need to get her out of the city, out of his reach." "You think that's going to stop him?" Shadow asked, his tone skeptical. "He's not going to just forget about her." "No," Hawk said firmly, "but we'll be ready for him. We'll make sure he can't touch her again." The group fell silent for a moment, each one of them lost in their own thoughts. Then Diesel stood up, his eyes sharp and focused. "We'll take her to the compound," he said. "It's isolated. No one will find her there." "Good," Hawk said, his voice thick with resolve. "We'll leave tonight." He turned toward the girl's room, his heart heavy with the weight of the responsibility he had taken on. As he opened the door and stepped inside, he saw her lying on the bed, still asleep. The sight of her, so fragile, so innocent, struck him with a sharp pain. She had been through so much already, and now, the threat of her stepfather still loomed over her. Hawk knelt beside her, careful not to wake her. He wanted to promise her that everything would be okay, but he knew that was a promise he couldn't keep. All he could do was make sure she was safe. He gently brushed a strand of hair away from her face, his hand lingering for a moment before he stood up. As he closed the door behind him, he glanced back at the girl one last time, silently vowing to keep her safe. The rest of the bikers were already preparing, loading up the bikes and getting everything in place. They moved quickly and efficiently, each of them ready to take on whatever challenge came their way. Hawk felt a surge of pride in his team. These weren't just bikers, they were family, and they would do whatever it took to protect her. "We're leaving in 10, Hawk said, his voice steady. "Get everything ready. We're not taking any chances." As the bikers mounted their bikes and started the engines, Hawk felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. This wasn't just another ride. This was a mission. They were protecting someone who needed them, and they weren't going to stop until she was safe. The convoy roared to life, the sound of the engines filling the night air as they made their way out of the city. Hawk rode at the front, leading the pack, his eyes scanning the streets for any sign of danger. He kept the pace steady, not too fast, not too slow, just enough to get them to the compound without drawing attention. The night was quiet, the city lights fading behind them as they rode further into the unknown. The girl was still asleep in the back, her body swaying gently with the motion of the bike. Hawk couldn't help but glance back at her every now and then, checking to make sure she was still safe. The ride was long, and every mile they put between them and the city felt like a victory. But Hawk knew that the real battle was just beginning. They had to stay ahead of the threat, and they had to keep her safe no matter what. As they approached the compound, the feeling of security began to settle in. The compound was isolated, surrounded by trees and miles of open land. It was the perfect place to hide. But Hawk knew that even in a place like this, they couldn't let their guard down. The stepfather would come for her, sooner or later. And when he did, they would be ready. Hawk slowed his bike as they neared the gates of the compound. The others followed suit, their engines humming as they came to a stop. The gate opened, and the convoy rode through, the sound of the motorcycles echoing through the empty space. Hawk glanced at the girl, still asleep, her face peaceful for the first time in what seemed like forever. "You're safe now," he whispered to himself. But he knew the fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The compound was quiet, the kind of silence that felt like it was holding its breath. Hawk had parked his bike near the main building and took a long look around, assessing the area. The place was secure, isolated. No one could easily find them here, but Hawk knew that didn't mean they were completely safe. The girl, still asleep in the back of the van, had finally relaxed after what felt like an eternity of tension. She had been through so much, and Hawk could see the weariness in her face. The fear had been overwhelming for her, but at least for now, she was safe. The rest of the crew started unloading their bikes and equipment, their movements practiced and efficient. Diesel and Colossus were setting up makeshift guard posts at the compound's perimeter, while the others checked the communications equipment. Hawk stood for a moment, watching them work, his thoughts on the girl and what they were facing. "We can't get too comfortable here," he muttered to himself. "He'll find us eventually." His mind raced with strategies. The girl's stepfather was relentless, and Hawk knew he wouldn't stop looking for her. It wasn't just the man's pride, it was his control. The girl had been his property in his eyes, and now that she had escaped, there was no telling what he would do. Hawk turned to the others, his face serious. We need to get a plan together. We can't keep running forever. Diesel, who had been keeping watch, turned to him. What do you suggest? We contact the authorities, Hawk said. But not just any authorities. We need to get someone who can take him down, legally, before he comes for her again. Diesel nodded. I know a few people, he said, his voice steady. I'll make the call. As Diesel worked the phone, Hawk checked in with Colossus, who was monitoring the entrance. Any movement? He asked. Colossus shook his head. Nothing yet. But I don't trust it. We're being too quiet. Hawk knew what Colossus meant. The quiet was dangerous. The silence could mean they were waiting. The girl's stepfather wasn't going to just walk away. Hawk walked over to the van where the girl was still resting. He could see the faint rise and fall of her chest, a peaceful moment in a storm that was far from over. He gently tapped on the door, making sure not to startle her. The girl's eyes fluttered open, and she sat up slowly, her face still showing traces of exhaustion. You're safe here, Hawk said softly. We'll protect you. You're not alone. She nodded, but Hawk could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She wasn't sure she could trust that promise. And Hawk understood. She had been let down by everyone who was supposed to protect her. He could feel her hesitation. Are you hungry? He asked, trying to keep the mood light. She nodded again, and for the first time, a small, tentative smile tugged at her lips. Just a little, she whispered. Hawk stepped aside to let her out, and she stood up slowly, her legs unsteady. It had been a long, hard day, and it wasn't over yet. As they made their way toward the small kitchen area in the compound, Hawk kept a watchful eye on the others. The rest of the group was in motion now, securing the compound and making sure there were no threats in sight. But Hawk knew they couldn't take any chances. Not with her. He glanced over his shoulder at the girl as she sat down at the table. You're going to be okay, he said quietly. She met his eyes, her gaze searching his face as though trying to find some hint of certainty in his words. I just want to go home, she said softly, her voice filled with sadness. Hawk's heart sank. He could tell she didn't mean the place they were at now. She meant her real home. A place where she could feel safe. A place where she wasn't scared all the time. I know, Hawk replied, his voice thick with emotion. But for now you're here. And that means you're safe. We're going to keep you safe, I promise. The girl looked at him for a long moment, her eyes studying him as though trying to decide whether or not to believe him. After what seemed like an eternity, she finally nodded. Thank you, she whispered. Hawk nodded, his expression softening. You don't have to thank me. We're family now, and family looks out for each other. The rest of the bikers were settling into their positions around the compound, preparing for whatever might come next. Hawk knew the girl's stepfather wouldn't give up easily, but they were ready. They had to be. Diesel came into the room then, his face grim. I made the call, he said. We've got someone on the inside, but it'll take a few days for them to get everything lined up. Good, Hawk said, standing up and walking toward the window. We need time, but not too much. We need to stay ahead of him. He glanced back at the girl, who was sitting quietly at the table, her hands folded in front of her. She was so small, so fragile, but there was strength in her eyes now. She wasn't giving up. We'll figure this out, Hawk said, his voice full of resolve. No one's taking you back. Not ever. As the sun began to set, the compound settled into an uneasy quiet. The bikers kept their watch, knowing that the night could bring anything. Hawk stood by the window, his eyes scanning the perimeter. They were safe for now, but they had to be ready. The fight wasn't over. But as long as they were together, Hawk knew they had a chance. The days had begun to blend together, each one a series of cautious movements and guarded moments. Hawk sat outside, his eyes scanning the horizon, his thoughts swirling. The girl, who had finally started to trust them, was still inside, resting. She hadn't spoken much since they'd brought her to the compound, but that wasn't unusual. Hawk knew trauma took time to heal, and she would speak when she was ready. The rest of the crew had settled into their roles, each one of them keeping watch, making plans, and preparing for the storm that they all knew was coming. Diesel was already on the phone again, reaching out to contacts, gathering intel. Colossus was going through the old police reports, trying to find something, anything, that could help them understand her stepfather's next move. Hawk's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He pulled it out and answered with a simple, yeah. It's done. Diesel's voice came through, steady and serious. I've got the files, the background, everything we need. Your guy came through. Hawk's heart beat a little faster at the news. Good, he replied. Send them over. Let's get this over with. As soon as Diesel ended the call, Hawk stood up, walking toward the small room where the girl was still resting. His steps were slow, deliberate. He knew she was scared. They all were. Her stepfather wouldn't stop until he had her back, and Hawk wasn't about to let that happen. The rest of the crew had gathered in the common room, discussing next steps. When Hawk walked in, they all stopped talking and looked at him. We've got the information we need, he said, his voice calm but firm. Now we need to decide how to use it. Diesel stepped forward, handing Hawk a folder. It's all here. Her stepfather, his connections, everything. He's not just some rogue cop. He's tied in with a lot of people. If we go after him directly, it's going to get messy. Hawk flipped through the folder, his eyes scanning the information. There were details on her stepfather's past, connections to gangs, corrupt officers, and even ties to organized crime. Hawk's stomach twisted as he read. The man was dangerous in ways that went beyond anything Hawk had expected. This is bigger than we thought, Hawk said, his voice low. We can't go in blind. We need a plan. A careful plan. So what's the move? Colossus asked, his voice steady, though Hawk could see the concern in his eyes. Hawk thought for a moment. We get her into witness protection, he said, looking at the group. It's the only way we can keep her safe. The bikers exchanged glances, the weight of the decision settling in. They had always been protectors, but this was a whole different level. You think she's ready for that? Diesel asked. Hawk nodded. She has no choice. Her stepfather is not going to stop until he gets her. We have to keep her off the grid, hidden. And how do we do that? Shadow asked. We can't just disappear without notice. Hawk took a deep breath. We get her somewhere no one will think to look. We lay low, stay quiet, and keep moving. We've got the resources, and we've got the team. But we can't stay here. Not with him out there. The group fell silent for a moment, considering the gravity of the situation. Finally, Diesel broke the silence. All right, I'll make the call. Get the paperwork moving. We'll need a fake identity for her, a whole new life. Hawk nodded. I'll handle the logistics. I know people who can help, but we need to move quickly. Time's running out. As the team went to work, Hawk stepped outside again, the cool night air hitting his face. He stood at the edge of the compound, looking out over the darkened landscape. The world felt heavy, like a storm was just waiting to break. He knew that protecting the girl was only part of the fight. They had to keep her safe from the one person who would stop at nothing to get her back. And Hawk wasn't about to let that happen. He heard the sound of footsteps behind him and turned to see the girl standing there, her small figure silhouetted against the dim light from the compound. Is it true? She asked, her voice soft but full of uncertainty. Am I really going to be safe? Hawk walked toward her, his heart heavy with the weight of his promise. Yes, he said gently. We'll make sure you're safe. No one is going to hurt you again. You have our word. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, full of hope and fear. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Hawk smiled softly, kneeling down to her level. You don't have to thank me. We're family now, and family looks out for each other. She nodded, her small hand reaching out to him. Hawk took her hand gently, feeling the warmth of her trust. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew they were ready. Together, they could face whatever came next. Let's get you settled in, Hawk said, standing up and leading her back toward the compound. We've got a plan, and we're going to make sure you're safe. That's what matters now. As they walked back into the compound, Hawk's mind was already racing with the next steps. But for now, in this moment, the girl was safe. And that was enough. The morning came with a crisp breeze that carried with it the scent of fresh pine and the faint hum of life just beginning. Hawk stood by the window, his eyes scanning the horizon, his mind still racing with plans and contingencies. The girl, now more settled in the compound, was still asleep in the small room where they had set her up. Hawk had made sure to keep her close, but he also knew the fight wasn't over. They had to keep moving, keep her hidden, keep her safe. Diesel came into the room, his face grim, his expression serious as he handed over a stack of papers. I've got something, he said, his voice low. Her stepfather's been making calls. He's not giving up. Hawk took the papers, his eyes flicking over the contents. There was a lot of information, but one thing stuck out. The stepfather was getting more desperate. He had connections, and that made him dangerous. He's reaching out to people, Hawk muttered under his breath. People who can make things happen. Diesel nodded, his eyes hardening. He won't stop until he finds her. Hawk slammed his fist down on the table, frustration rising in his chest. I know. We can't let him get to her. Not again. The rest of the crew was already making preparations for the next move. Diesel was on the phone with a contact who might be able to help, while Colossus and Shadow were checking the perimeter, making sure no one had followed them to the compound. Hawk didn't want to take any chances. As the day wore on, the sense of urgency grew. They needed to get the girl to a new location, one that was even more secure than this compound. Hawk knew they couldn't stay in one place for too long. They were too exposed. The bikers were ready, but the real challenge was going to be getting the girl out of the city without attracting attention. We're moving her tonight, Hawk said, his voice steady. We don't have the luxury of time. We need to get her out, and we need to do it quietly. Diesel finished his call and walked over to him. I've got a safe house lined up, he said, his voice low. It's off the grid. No one will find her there. Hawk nodded, the plan falling into place. Good. Let's make sure it stays that way. As the sun began to set, the bikers packed up, ready for the journey ahead. They were taking the girl to a new location, one that was hidden in plain sight, and they had to make sure nothing went wrong. Hawk was already thinking ahead. The stepfather wasn't going to stop until he had her, and Hawk couldn't afford to underestimate him. Stay close, Hawk told the girl as he approached her room. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her small hands folded in her lap. Her face was pale, but there was a spark of something in her eyes, something that hadn't been there before. We're moving you tonight, Hawk said gently. We need to get you to a safer place. The girl nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't want to go back. Hawk's heart clenched at the words. You won't. We won't let him take you back. Not again. He offered her a small smile, trying to reassure her, though he knew the fight was far from over. We're family now, and family looks out for each other. The girl stood up slowly, her body still stiff from the fear she had been carrying. Thank you, she whispered, looking up at him with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. You don't have to thank me, Hawk said, his voice soft. We're doing this because it's the right thing to do. We're here for you. The rest of the bikers were ready, their bikes lined up and ready to roll. Diesel was already checking the route, making sure they wouldn't be followed. Colossus and Shadow were in place, keeping an eye on the surroundings, and Hawk made sure the girl was safely tucked away in the van before they left. The convoy of bikes started up, the engines roaring to life in the cool evening air. Hawk's eyes stayed on the rearview mirror, watching for any sign that they were being followed. The ride was long, and the road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt like they were making progress. They were moving, and that was something. The night felt thick with tension, but Hawk couldn't let himself slow down. He had to stay focused, stay sharp. They were getting closer to the safe house, and once they were there, they would be able to regroup and plan their next move. Hawk kept his pace steady, making sure to stay out of sight. The road was quiet, the only sounds coming from the engines and the rush of wind against the bikes. It felt like they were a world away from everything. But Hawk knew that at any moment, things could change. The girl was still vulnerable, and her stepfather wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted. The ride felt endless, the darkness pressing in on them as they sped down the road. Hawk could feel the weight of the girl's safety on his shoulders, but he wasn't about to give up. He couldn't. They had come too far. As the convoy finally pulled into the safe house, Hawk took a deep breath, feeling a small sense of relief. They were here, but the real work was just beginning. He glanced over at the girl, who was looking out the window, her face illuminated by the headlights of the bikes. She looked calm now, but Hawk knew the fight was far from over. He turned to Diesel. Get the place secured. No one comes in, no one leaves. Diesel nodded, and the bikers moved quickly to get the area locked down. Hawk watched as they made their preparations, the weight of what was coming settling in. This was far from over. And Hawk wasn't about to let them lose now. He wasn't about to let her down. The safe house was tucked away in a remote area, surrounded by trees and miles of empty land. The quiet night enveloped the compound as the convoy of bikers rolled in, their engines rumbling softly as they brought the girl to safety. Hawk was at the front, guiding the way, his mind focused on what needed to be done next. As the bikes came to a stop, Diesel and Colossus began securing the area, checking for any signs of surveillance or unwanted visitors. Hawk stayed with the girl, watching her as she stepped off the van, still quiet, but with a sense of calm that hadn't been there before. The moment they had been waiting for had arrived. For now, they were safe. But Hawk knew this was just another temporary pause in a long game. They couldn't stay here forever. The girl, her eyes still filled with uncertainty, looked up at Hawk. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice soft. "You're safe here," Hawk replied, his voice gentle but firm. "This is a place where no one can find you. For now, you rest." She nodded, glancing around at the secluded surroundings. The house was small but sturdy, the kind of place that blended into the landscape without drawing attention. It wasn't luxurious, but it was home for now. The other bikers were setting up patrols and keeping watch. The atmosphere was tense, but there was a quiet understanding among the crew. They had a job to do, and they weren't about to fail. Hawk led the girl inside, motioning for her to sit at the small wooden table in the kitchen. He made sure she was comfortable, then grabbed a bottle of water and handed it to her. "You've been through a lot," he said, sitting across from her. "But you're safe now. You're not alone anymore." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes still filled with uncertainty. "How do you know that?" she asked quietly. "How do you know I'm safe?" Hawk smiled gently. "Because I promised you. And when we make a promise, we keep it. We don't back down. We protect our own." She nodded slowly, the weight of his words sinking in. Hawk could see the doubt still lingering in her eyes. But there was something else there too, a flicker of hope. It was small, but it was there. And that was enough. "You're stronger than you think," Hawk said softly, leaning forward. "You've made it this far. You're not going to let anyone take that away from you." She gave him a small, tentative smile. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. "I'm scared." Hawk's heart went out to her. He knew the feeling of being scared, of not knowing who to trust, of feeling like the world was too much to handle. "It's okay to be scared," he said. "We're all scared. But we face it together. And we keep moving forward." The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, and Diesel stepped into the room, his expression serious. "Hawk," he said, his voice low. "We've got a problem." Hawk stood up immediately, his instincts kicking in. "What's going on?" "It's the stepfather," Diesel replied, his eyes hardening. "He's been making moves. I've got word he's getting close." Hawk's stomach tightened. He knew this moment would come, but he wasn't ready for it. Not yet. "How close?" "Too close," Diesel said. He's sniffing around. "We need to move her again. Fast." Hawk turned to the girl, his face hardening. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice full of determination. "We can't stay here. But I promise you, we'll keep you safe. You're not going anywhere near him. Not again." She nodded, her fear returning. But there was something in her eyes now. A trust, a quiet understanding that these people would protect her no matter what. Hawk turned back to Diesel. "Get the others ready. We leave now." Diesel nodded, stepping out of the room to make the call. Hawk turned back to the girl, his gaze softening. "You're not alone," he said. "We'll make sure he never hurts you again." The girl swallowed hard, nodding as she stood up. "Thank you," she whispered. Hawk placed a hand on her shoulder, offering her a small smile. "We're family now," he said, his voice steady. "And family takes care of each other." The room was filled with the low hum of the bikes starting up, and the group began to prepare to move out. Hawk's mind raced as he gave quick instructions to the rest of the crew. They had to move fast, and they had to be smart. Her stepfather wasn't just a threat to her. He was a threat to everyone who stood in his way. But Hawk wasn't backing down. They were ready. And no matter where they went, they would make sure the girl was safe. As the convoy of bikes rolled out of the compound, Hawk glanced over his shoulder at the girl, who was riding alongside him. She looked uncertain, but Hawk knew that with every mile they put between them and her stepfather, she would begin to feel safer. They weren't just running away. They were moving forward, away from the fear that had controlled her life for so long. And Hawk was going to make sure she never had to face it alone again. The convoy rolled out of the compound with a sense of urgency, the roar of the bikes cutting through the quiet of the night. Hawk kept his eyes on the road, his thoughts racing as they moved further from the safe house. The weight of the decision they had just made hung heavily on him. They were on the move again, but this time, the girl was in danger once more. Her stepfather was closing in, and Hawk knew the clock was ticking. The girl was sitting in the back of the van, her head resting against the window. Hawk glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She was quiet, her eyes distant, and for a moment, Hawk wondered what was going through her mind. She had been through so much already, and now they were running again. It wasn't the life she should be living, but it was the only choice they had left. Hawk's grip on the handlebars tightened. He couldn't fail her now. He had promised to keep her safe, and he wasn't about to break that promise. The convoy had taken the back roads, avoiding the main highways to keep a low profile. Diesel was leading the way, and Colossus and Shadow were taking up the rear. They had split into smaller groups to ensure the girls' safety, with a few bikers staying close to the van. The plan was simple: get to the next safe house, lay low, and figure out their next move. The girl's stepfather was resourceful. He had connections, and Hawk knew that if they weren't careful, they could be walking right into a trap. How long until we reach the safe house? Hawk asked, his voice steady as he spoke to Diesel through the comms. About an hour, Diesel replied, his voice low and calm. We're sticking to the back roads, but we'll need to keep our eyes open. No telling who might be watching. Hawk nodded, his focus never wavering from the road ahead. They had to get there quickly. The longer they were on the move, the more likely it was that they would be spotted. His mind flashed back to the girl, to the fear in her eyes when she had first come to them for help. She had been so young, so vulnerable, and now, Hawk couldn't help but feel responsible for her. He wasn't going to let anyone take her away. He couldn't. As the convoy made its way through the darkened roads, Hawk kept his attention on every corner, every shadow. They were close, but Hawk knew better than to let his guard down. It was only when they were inside the safe house, hidden from view, that they would be able to breathe easy. The girl stirred in the back of the van, and Hawk's gaze flicked to the rearview mirror. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face as though trying to understand what was happening. "Are we there yet?" she asked quietly. Hawk forced a smile, even though he could feel the exhaustion in his own body. "Almost," he said. "Just a little longer." She nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Hawk couldn't imagine what she was feeling. To be on the run, to never know if the next moment would bring safety or danger. It wasn't a life any child should have to endure, but as long as she was with them, Hawk was determined to protect her. The road stretched on, dark and empty, the occasional flash of headlights in the distance. The convoy stayed in tight formation, moving swiftly but carefully. Every turn, every stoplight, every road sign was an opportunity for someone to notice them, to follow them. Hawk's mind kept racing, his thoughts focused on their next steps. When they got to the safe house, they would have to figure out what to do next. They couldn't stay hidden forever. They needed to find a way to put an end to this, to stop the girl's stepfather from coming after her again. The girl leaned forward, her voice breaking the silence. "Why is he doing this?" she asked, her words quiet but filled with hurt. Hawk glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his heart aching. He had been dreading this moment, dreading the questions she would ask. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew he had to try. "I don't know," he said, his voice softer now. "But we won't let him hurt you again." She looked out the window, her face distant. Hawk could see the tears starting to well in her eyes, but she didn't cry. She hadn't cried much since they had met. She was strong, stronger than most adults he knew. Hawk's thoughts returned to her stepfather. The man had a reputation, connections that went deep. He wasn't just dangerous because of his position in law enforcement. He was dangerous because he had the means to get what he wanted, no matter who stood in his way. And he wanted her back. Hawk couldn't let that happen. The road began to open up as they neared their destination. The safe house was just around the corner, and Hawk's eyes narrowed as he focused on the path ahead. The convoy slowed, and Diesel signaled that they were close. Hawk's heart rate picked up as they reached the gates of the safe house. The area was isolated, just the way they liked it. There were no neighbors, no prying eyes. Just an old farmhouse that had been converted into a hideout for people who needed to disappear. As they passed through the gates, Hawk felt a brief moment of relief. But it didn't last long. He knew the real battle was just beginning. They had to stay one step ahead of the stepfather, and Hawk wasn't going to rest until they were safe. As the convoy parked and the engines cut off, Hawk turned to the girl. "We're safe for now," he said, his voice filled with resolve. "But we've still got work to do. We won't stop until you're safe, and we'll do whatever it takes to make sure of that." She looked at him, her face softening for the first time in what felt like days. "Thank you," she whispered. Hawk nodded, a quiet promise in his eyes. He wasn't giving up on her. Not now, not ever. The safe house was quiet, the only sound being the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant hum of the engine idling as the last of the bikers made their way inside. Hawk stood outside, his eyes scanning the perimeter, his thoughts racing. They had made it this far, but he knew they couldn't afford to relax. Not yet. Not while her stepfather was still out there. The girl, now inside, was resting, though Hawk knew sleep wasn't something she could easily come by after everything she'd been through. The tension in the house was palpable. Diesel, Colossus, and Shadow were keeping a watchful eye on everything. They were ready for anything, but Hawk could see the unease in their eyes. They all knew that the real danger hadn't passed. It was just waiting for the right moment to strike. He rubbed his face, feeling the weight of the responsibility pressing down on him. This wasn't just about keeping one girl safe. It was about stopping a man who had crossed every line and wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. "We need a plan," Hawk muttered under his breath. He walked inside, where the rest of the crew was already gathered. Diesel looked up from his phone. "We're good on this end," he said. "No sign of anyone following us. But we need to figure out what's next." "The clock's ticking." Hawk nodded. "We need to make sure the girl is never found. We have to put her in a place where no one can touch her." He paused, thinking about their options. "We can't keep moving her. We need to make her disappear. Completely." Diesel raised an eyebrow. "You're talking about getting her out of the system?" Hawk gave a single nod. "I know people. People who can help. But it's going to take time." "Time's the one thing we don't have," Colossus said, his deep voice steady. "Her stepfather's not going to wait around. He's going to keep looking." Hawk met Colossus's eyes, knowing he was right. "I know, but we have to play it smart. If we rush this, it could blow up in our faces." Shadow, who had been quiet up until now, spoke up. "And what if he finds her before we get her into the system?" Hawk's gaze hardened. "Then we fight. But we don't let him take her. Not again." The room fell silent. Hawk's words were heavy, and they knew the stakes. This wasn't just a fight to protect one person. It was a battle against someone who had no boundaries. They couldn't let him win. They wouldn't. Diesel stood up. "All right, I'll make the calls. Start moving the pieces." "Good," Hawk replied. "And I want everyone to stay on high alert. No mistakes." The bikers nodded and began to disperse. As Hawk turned to leave the room, he glanced at the girl's door. She was still asleep, or at least pretending to be. He knew she was afraid. They all were. But Hawk wasn't going to let that fear stop them. He walked toward her room, taking a deep breath before he knocked softly on the door. "Hey," he said gently when he heard a quiet murmur from inside. "How are you holding up?" She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her knees drawn to her chest, her arms wrapped around them. She looked up when he entered, her face pale, her eyes filled with the uncertainty of someone who had seen too much. "I'm scared," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Hawk sat down beside her, careful not to crowd her. "I know," he said softly, "but you're not alone. We're here, and we're not going anywhere." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as though trying to read him. "Will it ever be over?" she asked, her voice breaking. Hawk swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her question. He had no easy answer for her. "I can't promise it will be easy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I promise you this. We're going to do everything in our power to make sure you're safe. You'll never be alone in this." The girl nodded, tears welling up in her eyes, though she didn't let them fall. Hawk placed a hand on her shoulder, offering a small but firm smile. "We'll keep you safe. That's what we do. We protect our own." She didn't say anything more, but Hawk could see a small glimmer of trust in her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He stood up and gave her a reassuring pat on the back. "We're moving you to a safer place soon. Just rest while you can." He left the room, his mind already turning over the next steps. The girl's stepfather was still out there, and he wasn't going to give up easily. But neither was Hawk. They had a plan, but plans could only go so far. In the end, it would come down to how far they were willing to go to protect her. And Hawk knew they would go as far as it took. As the night fell, the bikers gathered around the compound, making sure everything was in place. Diesel had already contacted the right people, but Hawk knew the next few days would be critical. If they were going to get the girl to safety, they had to move fast and keep moving. He glanced at the girl's room one last time before heading outside to join the others. The air was cool, and the night felt still, but Hawk could feel the storm building. This was far from over. But he wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The night was colder now, the wind carrying with it a sense of finality. Hawk stood outside the compound, watching the moonlight filter through the trees, his thoughts on the girl and the journey ahead. She had been through so much, and now, they were finally getting her to safety. But even as he felt a small sense of relief, his mind was still on alert. The job wasn't done yet. It wouldn't be done until she was out of harm's way for good. Diesel had made the call, and now the paperwork was in motion. They had a plan, and they were going to get the girl to a secure location, a place where her stepfather couldn't reach her. But Hawk knew the hardest part was still ahead. They couldn't take chances. They couldn't afford mistakes. Her stepfather was relentless. Hawk had seen that in the way he moved, the way he played the system. He wasn't going to stop until he had her back, no matter the cost. But Hawk wasn't backing down. Not after everything they had been through. He had promised to protect her, and he would keep that promise, no matter what. As the hours passed, the rest of the crew kept busy. Diesel had made sure all the equipment was in place, and Colossus and Shadow were making sure no one followed them to the compound. Hawk stayed by the door, his hand resting on the handle as he stared into the night. The quiet around them felt like a trap, the calm before the storm. He didn't know when or where it would come, but he knew it was coming. And when it did, they had to be ready. He turned and walked back inside, his boots tapping softly against the floor as he made his way to the girl's room. She was sitting on the bed, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the floor. She looked up when he entered, her eyes filled with that same uncertainty. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle but full of concern. She nodded slowly, though the doubt in her eyes remained. "I'm just tired," she said quietly. Hawk walked over and sat down beside her. "You've been through a lot," he said. "You've been strong. Stronger than most people would be in your situation." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "But I don't feel strong," she whispered. "I feel lost." Hawk's heart clenched as he heard her words. He knew the feeling of being lost, of not knowing who you were anymore. But he also knew that no matter how lost you felt, there was always a way back. "I know you're scared," he said softly, "but you're not alone. You've got us. We're here for you, and we'll make sure you're safe. We're not giving up on you." The girl stayed silent for a moment, then slowly nodded, a small, faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Hawk smiled back, though his mind was still racing. The plan was in motion, but they weren't out of the woods yet. He needed to keep her safe, no matter what it took. "You need to get some rest," he said, standing up. "We've got a long road ahead of us, but we're going to get through this. I promise." As he turned to leave the room, he felt a shift in the air. The stillness of the night had changed. It was no longer quiet. There was something out there, something moving in the shadows. Hawk's instincts kicked in. He turned back to the girl. "Stay here," he said, his voice low and commanding. "Do not open this door for anyone, no matter what." She nodded quickly, her eyes wide with fear. Hawk walked to the door and signaled for Diesel, Colossus, and Shadow to meet him outside. They moved quickly, their bodies blending into the darkness as they made their way to the perimeter. Hawk's eyes scanned the area. His mind focused. He could feel it now. Someone was out there. Someone who didn't belong. Diesel's voice came through the comms, sharp and urgent. "Hawk, we've got movement. They're coming in from the east. We need to move, now." Hawk's heart skipped a beat. Her stepfather had found them. He cursed under his breath and turned back to the house. "Get her out of here," he said, his voice steady. "Now, get to the van. Move fast." As the bikers sprang into action, Hawk kept his eyes on the approaching threat. He had no idea how close they were or how many people were coming, but he knew they couldn't afford to wait any longer. He rushed back into the house, finding the girl in the hallway, her eyes wide with panic. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. Hawk grabbed her hand, his grip firm. "We're moving you again. Stay close to me." They made their way toward the van, the sound of footsteps echoing in the distance. Hawk's pulse was pounding in his ears. They were almost there, just a few more steps, and they would be in the clear. But just as they reached the door, the sound of a loud crash echoed through the house. Hawk's blood ran cold. The front door had been kicked in. Her stepfather was here. The moment of calm was over. It was time to fight. Hawk pushed the girl into the van and slammed the door shut, turning to face the incoming danger. The bikers were already in position, ready to protect. Hawk's eyes locked on the front door, waiting for the inevitable. They were ready. And this time, they weren't backing down.